Okay, we're still in January of 2015. We pick up with question 20. Major cause of antagonism, that is hatred, toward the new immigrants who came to the United States after 1880. Okay, now if we remember, that's a term you sometimes see, old immigration was before the Civil War, so 1840s, 50s, 60s. The vast majority of that was Irish immigration and German immigration. After the Civil War, you get what's called the new immigrants, 1870s, 80s on. A lot of them are still German. There's a new wave of German immigrants, but you also have a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Ukraine. You get a wave of immigrants from Southern Europe, meaning Greece and Italy. And mixed in with the Eastern European immigrants, but kind of forming their own ethnic group, are large numbers of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Okay. Major cause of antagonism toward the new immigrants, 1880, was the belief that what? Four, competed with Americans for jobs as unskilled laborers. Now let's look at the other choices there. Did they believe they were better educated than native-born Americans? No, for the most part they weren't. They didn't come over with a great deal of education. Aside from the Germans, who did have some, most of these groups came over with very little. Belief that they had a higher standard of living than most Americans? No. Most of these immigrants came over, they were really crushingly poor and lived in the poorest of the poor neighborhoods of the big cities. A belief they adapted easily to American culture? No. This is the period of time in which you get the Jewish neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where you could have gone blocks and blocks and found nobody who spoke anything except Yiddish, the Jewish language. It's the same time period where you get the Little Italies. Little Italy in Manhattan. If you know the Bronx, there's a Little Italy in the Bronx, in the Belmont section of the Bronx. In Boston, there's the Italian North End of Boston. In Philadelphia, there's the Italian neighborhood in Philadelphia. So you get, pockets of Italians. And similarly with these other ethnic groups, they kind of stayed to themselves for at least the first few years that they were here. So they're not adapting to American culture quickly. Competed with Americans for jobs as unskilled laborers. Yes, many of them came over with no skills. And so what did they go to work as? Well, the Italians, many of the Italians who came over, helped to build the New York City subway system, to dig the hole, the tunnels for that. Many of the Polish immigrants worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. So the fear was that if I'm an unskilled native-born American guy, now I'm competing with these immigrants. Okay. 21. Secretary of State John Hay sent his open door notes to world powers. To do what? When you see that phrase, open door, the open door policy was the United States saying to China, we want to trade with you, China. This is just at 1900. So China is just beginning to open to the world. John Hay says, we want to trade with you, China, on the same basis everybody else does. We want you to treat the United States equally with Britain, France, Germany, some of these other countries, Portugal, that were engaging in trade with China. So the open door policy is about U.S. trading interests with China whenever you see that. Therefore, protect U.S. trading interests with China. Just remember that. If they ask a question about the open door, it will be about that. Okay, question 22. We have a quote here. Let's notice it's from the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, known as WCTU. Temperance means it's about prohibition, getting rid of alcohol, right? Christian. It was motivated by their belief in bringing good Christian morality to everyone and protecting the vulnerable, wives and kids, from alcoholism in the family. Okay, so let's see what they say. We therefore formulate and for ourselves adopt the following pledge, asking our sisters and brothers of a common danger and a common hope to make common cause with us in working its reasonable and helpful precepts into the practice of everyday life. Okay, so here's their oath that they took. I hereby solemnly promise, God helping me, to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, including wine, beer, and cider, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same. So this was their oath that they took, that they wouldn't drink anything alcoholic themselves, and that they would discourage other people from drinking and engaging in liquor trade. According to this passage, those who adopted this pledge believed that alcohol consumption was damaging to society. Which, again, don't scoff at it. At the time, it was like the heroin epidemic of today, and they wanted to fight it, so this was what they did. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, did they succeed? Well, again, we have that 18th Amendment to the Constitution right after World War I, 1919, that puts prohibition in, bans the sale of alcohol. And that lasts a little over 10 years, up until the early 1930s. So all through the 1920s we had prohibition. So they got their law. The problem was the law didn't work. It didn't really stop people from drinking. Okay. One major goal of the progressive movement. Remember, the progressive movement is about ending corruption in government, ending corruption in business, and giving the little guy a fair deal in dealing with government and business. So instead of getting pushed around by the rich or by the powerful, instead of getting cheated by businesses, you were going to empower the little guy. That's what progressivism is about. One major goal of the progressive movement was doing what? To pass laws to help solve economic and social problems. That's what they were about. They saw poverty around them. They saw little guys getting cheated at work. They saw them getting cheated by businesses. They saw powerful politicians manipulating the political system. So this is what they were about, to pass laws to help solve economic and social problems. The other ones don't fit, by the way. To balance the federal budget by decreasing spending? No, they wanted to increase government spending. Provide unemployment insurance to workers. That might have been a good idea, but the progressives didn't really think of it at the time. Limit citizen control over government. No, just the opposite. They wanted more average guy control over government. So 4 is the only one that fits. Okay, question 24. One foreign policy goal of President Theodore Roosevelt was to do what? Okay. This is a slightly tricky question. The correct answer is number 2. Did you spot it? Okay. Number 2 is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember the Monroe Doctrine from the early 1800s, 1820s? James Monroe says, Europe, stay out of Latin America, and we will stay out of Europe. The Roosevelt corollary was that the United States, now this is Teddy Roosevelt in 1904, said the United States would send the military into Latin American countries to keep European influence out and to keep governments that were friendly to the United States. So number 2 is the correct answer. Your other choices here. To limit U.S. investment in Latin America, no. He actually wanted the United States to put money and business into Latin America because it would help to control Latin America. Teddy Roosevelt to encourage independence movements in Africa? No, he had no real interest in independence in Africa. This is the one that I'm afraid you would have picked. Create future states by annexing Pacific Island territories. No. First of all, the Pacific Island territories that the United States got, Guam and the Philippines, which we got during the Spanish-American War, and Hawaii, which we got separately, not from the Spanish-American War, even though it was just about the same time. We got those before Teddy Roosevelt was ever president. And when we got them, nobody really talked about making them states. We wanted those islands in the Pacific because we wanted them for Navy bases and for trading, but nobody was talking much about making them states. So number 1 is sort of the trick answer in there that you needed to avoid. This, number 2, is another way of stating the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. They always ask about the Monroe Doctrine, and they like to find a way to ask about the Roosevelt corollary. 25. W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Okay, when you see those two, you should think about the black civil rights, early civil rights movement. These guys, you're talking about right around 1900, late 1800s, early 20th century. Okay? So 1890s, 1900 is what you're thinking. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois are the sort of two bookend characters of that time period. Booker T. Washington said blacks should win the respect of whites by educating themselves for jobs and showing white society that the black man is just as good and just as industrious and just as productive as the white man. So Booker T. Washington starts the Tuskegee Institute, which is all about training blacks for jobs. W.E.B. Du Bois says black men don't have to prove anything to anybody. We are just as good as the white man, and the Constitution says we have the same rights. Therefore, we should go to court and insist that white businesses and white governments recognize our constitutional rights. And so he was all about educating black young men not to be carpenters and plumbers like Booker T. Washington, but to be lawyers and university professors. So, what did they most strongly disagree over? methods to achieve racial equality. They both believed in racial equality. They were both black men and very intelligent black men, scholars in their own right. But they said they had two different approaches to how to achieve it. Question 26. After World War I, senators who opposed the United States' participation in the League of Nations. Okay, what's going on? World War I, Woodrow Wilson goes over to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles includes this League of Nations, which would be a world police force to enforce peace. If the U.S. had been part of it, then if any country had gotten out of line, the U.S. would have had no choice but been required by the treaty to jump in with its army to stop that nation from getting out of line. He comes back to the United States to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified by the Senate, and the Senate won't do it. Why? Because the Senate was afraid it would involve the United States in future world conflicts. We had just finished World War I, and most senators and most Americans wanted to go back to isolationism. Slip back into isolationism and stay the hell out of the rest of the world. The rest of the world leave us alone. And so they wouldn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles or U.S. participation in the League of Nations, which is one of the reasons why the League of Nations failed and why we wound up with World War II. 27. The Great Migration during World War I refers to what? Specifically, simple vocabulary. The Great Migration is African Americans moving to northern cities to find work. Again, blacks in the South are still being heavily discriminated against. The South is kind of backward and poor anyway because it's still about cotton farming. The North is industrialized, and during World War I, you had a big expansion of the factories. So blacks move from the South up to Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Akron, Pittsburgh, New York, all of these towns in Michigan, Illinois, Chicago, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York City to work in the new defense factories. Okay, let's look at number 30. Oh, no, sorry. What am I up to? 28. Major factor leading to the erosion, that is, the wearing away of regional cultural differences in the 1920s. All right, this is a little bit of a trick question. Not much, but what smooths out regional cultural differences in the 20s? Radio and motion pictures. Television is the trick question. Trick answer. Wrong. Television does not become a consumer product until really the 1950s, the very late 1940s. First, in the 20s, comes radio and movies. And with radio comes national radio programs. So as I said to you in class, if you had listened to somebody in 1900, before World War I, if you had gotten a kid from Louisiana and a kid from northern Michigan and a kid from Maine and a kid from New York City and had them all talk together, they could barely understand each other. The brands of stuff that they bought in the store, they were all regional brands, local. A lot of the vocabulary they used, if you went into a shop in Maine and asked for a hero and a soda, you want to buy lunch. Oh, give me a hero. I'll have a meatball hero and a soda. They wouldn't have had any idea what the hell you were talking about. A Maine kid would have walked into a store in New York City and asked for a grinder and a pop. And they would have been looked at like they had, two heads. But that's what a hero and a soda was in Maine. Little things like that start to get smoothed out across the country as people begin to listen to national radio programs. It affects their speech. It kind of smooths out the differences. Same thing with motion pictures. As movies become the national way that everybody is, the entertainment that everybody's seeing, people in Mississippi are looking at movies that are set in New York City, and it's kind of smoothing out the cultural differences. Television does that as well a lot, but it does it in the 1950s, not in the 1920s. The novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis were very important in the 1920s, but they don't really do anything for cultural differences. And the expansion of air travel after Charles Lindbergh's flight, that doesn't really do anything either. Air travel doesn't become something that becomes common until really, again, the 1950s. In the 20s and 30s, air travel is mostly for the wealthy and for the military. Question 29. During the 1920s, the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, the Palmer raids, and the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Let's remember what those are. Sacco and Vanzetti were these two Italian guys in Massachusetts, around Boston. They got picked up for a robbery. The robbery really happened. A guard was really killed. Who did the robbery? Well, to this day, scholars argue whether either Sacco or Vanzetti or both were innocent or guilty. What is sure is that the trial they got was a completely unfair trial, and they got an unfair trial because they were Italian immigrants and therefore assumed to be suspect. The Palmer raids, remember, and it's in the notes, A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General of the United States, this is the 1920s. Palmer uses federal law to round up anybody he suspects of being a radical, that is, a communist or a potential terrorist. And really, he's just rounding up immigrants. And then the revival of Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, of course, hated black people, but they also hated immigrants, particularly Catholics. Okay, what do these tell you? One, nativist sentiments were on the rise. Remember what nativism means. It means a belief that the only good American is an American who is born in this country, whose parents were born in this country, who speaks English and is a white Protestant Christian. That's nativism. Only native-born Americans are any good. Fear of immigrants. The other choices here. Cultural values were similar between urban and rural Americans. Well, no, doesn't really have anything to do with that. Popular support for international involvement was increasing. No, in fact, it was fear of international involvement and people from other countries that was driving it. Public support for limiting immigration was declining, just the opposite. In this time period, remember, it's in the notes, we passed the National Origins Act. And what is the National Origins Act about? It's a way to limit immigration, basically to shut down immigration in the 1920s. Okay? 30. A major difference between the philosophies of Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt in responding to the Great Depression. Simple. Herbert Hoover was all about laissez-faire. Let business fix itself. If government interferes too much, you're just going to prolong the agony. Roosevelt said government's job is to step in and sort of prop up the economy and prop up people's lives while we wait for the economy to fix itself. What's the difference? Major difference, okay, is that Roosevelt supported direct relief to people out of work. Number 3. Hoover wanted to rely on private charities to provide assistance. He said government should stay out, as I just said, and that, yes, there are poor people out there, and we should let the churches and the private civic groups take care of them. Hoover also stressed the need for individual self-reliance. If you're out of work, well, you got to learn to pick yourself up and keep going. Didn't really explain how to do that. Thought the government should not be involved in economic reform. That's also Herbert Hoover. So the only one of these that doesn't reflect Herbert Hoover's philosophy is the idea that government should give assistance to people out of work right away. Which federal agency, created during the New Deal, was intended to prevent serious problems in the stock market? Got to remember what these are. Securities and Exchange Commission. Stock exchange. Stocks are called a kind of financial security. Securities are investments. It's a code word in business for investments. So the Securities and Exchange Commission was the Investments and Stock Exchange Commission, SEC. And they were there to create new rules and act as a kind of umpire and referee in the stock markets to prevent them from crashing again. Let's just remind ourselves what the rest of these are. Agricultural Adjustment Administration, as the name implies, agricultural. That was about trying to help farmers out during the Depression by giving them, by supporting farm prices and paying them in some cases not to grow things. Works Progress Administration, WPA, was that government agency that created jobs by creating construction projects. Let's build a dam, let's build a bridge, let's build a post office, let's build a new park, and we'll hire guys with skills and unskilled laborers to do the work. And Social Security Administration, of course, is about creating a kind of safety net old age pension system to make sure people were not starving to death, and also for disability pensions, that sort of thing. Okay, and then let's do 32 and 33. Here we go. Here's another one of those political cartoons. They love these. The Supreme Court, says at the top. And there you have a picture. You should kind of recognize that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, gentlemen, is any of my legislation before the court today? Great big FDR. And there we see him over the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay. Main idea of this 1937 cartoon is that the president is attempting to exercise too much influence over the Supreme Court. Remember, the court had started to push against some of his ideas, saying maybe he's going too far. Roosevelt came up with the idea of packing the court. 9 members of the court? Well, let's make it 15, and then I can appoint the majority of members of the court. And the Congress said, no, that's presidential power too far. So one outcome of the situation referred to in the cartoon is that Congress rejected Roosevelt's effort to pack the Supreme Court. Okay. We'll leave this one here, and then I'll pick up with the next video with question 34.